Okay, so in this lesson we're going to look at classification, and classification is actually a really easy topic. Um, the first thing that you need to know is that the science of classification is called taxonomy. So taxonomy is all about how you group things together, and that's what classification is about, trying to figure out what goes with what. This is a natural kind of instinct. Human beings love to group things together, and we group things together so that we know how things relate to one another in the natural world. The first classification scheme on record is credited to this guy right here. This is Aristotle, okay? And he had two groups. His groups were plants and animals, and then he had a subgroup based on where the organisms lived, and his groups were sea, air, and land. So under the plants there was a sea, an air, and a land, and then under animal there was sea, air, and land. Obviously this scheme didn't stick, so it obviously was not perfect. One of the problems with this scheme is, what do you do with something like a frog that lives both in the water and on land? You know, it's kind of hard to classify that. Something else that's a problem is you would classify whales and fish and lobsters and shrimp and sea sponges and jellyfish all together, right? Because they're all sea animals. The problem is they don't really belong grouped together because they have different ancestry and they evolved along different lines. You know, you don't group mammals with crustaceans like a lobster and a whale. You don't group fishes in with either of those groups. So there's some obvious problems with this scheme, and it didn't stick around. If you fast forward to modern day, what you get is the modern classification scheme, which you see here. Okay, starting with domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And you will need to have these memorized. Okay, so you need to know these in order. You can do that using a mnemonic device like dumb king Philip came over from Germany swimming. You could say dumb kings play cards on flat green stools, you know, something like that. But use a mnemonic device and get these memorized in order. A couple things about this scheme. The biggest category is at the top, okay? So the largest, here's the largest, here's the smallest category at the bottom, okay? Also, though, as you move down this list, you get more in common. Okay, so in other words, your largest category might include a bunch of different organisms in it, like, for example, polar bears and wolves and whales and humans and tigers and things like that, right? But as you go down the list, all of those that's a big category of animals there, but as you go down the list, they all fit in the same domain and kingdom, but then you start losing them at phylum, class, order, family, and then finally down at the bottom, the genus and species is just the things that are in that group. So you get more in common as you go down. Since this is the smallest category, the things in that category have more in common. All right, so that was modern classification. Let's back up just a little bit now, and let's talk about Carl von Linné. Carl von Linné was a Swedish aristocrat, and this is his picture right down here in the corner. Because he was an aristocrat, he didn't really have to have a job. Okay, so he had money, he was born with money, he had an estate, and he had a lot of time on his hands, and since he had a lot of time on his hands, he became interested in classifying organisms. But also he became interested in a common naming system. Okay, and the reason why this was important is because you could have a scientist in Africa studying an African violet, you could have a scientist in Europe studying an African violet, and you could have a scientist in South America studying an African violet. And because in each place they were using what the local people called that plant as its name, and therefore when they were writing about the plant in the literature, nobody realized they were talking about the same thing. Okay, so unfortunately common names are not that common. They vary from region to region, and so what we needed was a system that everybody could understand that was a scientific naming system. And Carl von Linné came up with this system, and it was called binomial nomenclature, which literally means two-name name system. Okay? And the key to binomial nomenclature is that the names are in Latin, and that's because Latin was the language of educated people. Okay? This took off. All of the scientific names are written in Latin, and they're written using this system that Carl von Linné came up with. Okay? So it's very important that you understand that. We're going to go into binomial nomenclature next here, and we'll look at how it works. But because this took off, this guy became a bit of a celebrity. You can go to his house. You can see all the things that he classified and named. You can walk through his garden and look at all of his scientific names and so on. But he also kind of felt like he revolutionized science, and so he changed his name to a Latinized version of his name. So you will only see him listed as Carolus Linnaeus now in your textbooks. So his name went from Carl von Linné, the Swedish version of his name, to the Latin version of his name. All right, so binomial nomenclature is really easy. Okay. All you have to do is take the modern classification scheme and take the last two steps in that scheme, the genus and species, and that's the binomial name. Okay. Now, grant you, Linnaeus, just as a side note, Linnaeus did not have all of the steps that you see here, okay? I think he was missing maybe order and another step. Domain didn't exist. Domain is new, like within the last 15 years, domain came into existence. So he didn't have domain. It was a shorter classification scheme. But he still had the genus and species. And the way that you write a binomial scientific name is what you see here. Notice you've got the genus capitalized, the species is lowercase, and if you are typing, it's in italics. Okay, it has to be italicized. If you are handwriting it, you're going to underline it. Underlining in handwriting is the same thing as italicizing in typing. All right, now if you abbreviate it like this. So the first letter of the genus, notice it's still capitalized. The first letter of the genus is still capitalized. Everything else is lowercase. But that's how you write a scientific name. Okay, that's binomial nomenclature. All right, just quickly, a couple things about scientific names. Let's look at this one. You know this one, right? Escherichia coli. This is E. coli. Some things about scientific names that you need to know. First of all, it's kind of like a scientific name is written backwards, okay? This is like your family name. Okay? And this one is like a first name. Okay? So, in other words, you know, just because, say, you have a cousin named Jennifer and your name is Jennifer, that doesn't mean, or say you see somebody else named Jennifer, you know, just because your cousin and you are named Jennifer and then you see somebody down the street named Jennifer, that doesn't mean you're all related because your name is Jennifer, right? It's the same thing here. Like the first name, like your first name, like Jennifer, this coli part is not what determines if two things are related. What determines if two things are related is if they fall into the same genus, Escherichia, okay? So this is like your last name, your family name, okay? So in other words, if your name is Baker and somebody else's last name is Baker, then you stand a better chance of having some sort of relatedness, okay? The other thing that you need to know here is that this last part, the coli part, is often either named for somebody who discovered it, named for where it was discovered, the species was discovered, and also sometimes it's a description. So for example, Quercus alba. Okay, Quercus alba. Alba means white in Latin. This is the genus of the white oak. Okay, so here's an example of alba. It's an adjective that describes the plant, the white oak. Okay, You might have something like Acer, which is the genus of maples. Acer japonica. Whoops, that's a lowercase j. Acer japonica, and hopefully you see Japan in the japonica, right? That's for the Japanese maple. So you're describing where this particular plant came from. You'll also see a lot of canadensis, things that come from Canada. You'll see a lot of Jeffersonianum, because Thomas Jefferson did a lot of classifying. So if something was classified by Thomas Jefferson or was discovered in or around Monticello, oftentimes it's named for him that way. All right, just a few things to wrap up here. First, what you need to understand is that modern classification is all about grouping things together based on evolutionary relationships. So you're grouping things together to try to get organisms classified with one another that have an evolutionary history, okay, and that's called phylogeny. It used to be that you would do this by looking at physical characteristics. Now we no longer look at physical characteristics. Now what we do is we examine the DNA. You can look at either DNA or we can look at macromolecules like proteins. You can look at the sequence of the amino acids in the proteins. And what you find is that organisms that are closely related have very, very similar DNA and protein sequences. And you're going to practice with this in one of your labs. Just really quickly, these are the 6 kingdoms. In the next unit, we're going to look at all 6 of these kingdoms, but what you need to do is just kind of for now, maybe make some flashcards of these and know the difference between them, identify main characteristics of each, okay? But our kingdoms are Archaebacteria and Eubacteria, and these are the only prokaryotic kingdoms. Everything else here is eukaryotic. All right, finally, when we are looking to represent how organisms are related, we need to use a graphic of some sort, and the 2 graphics that we call on are cladograms and phylogenetic trees. Here is a cladogram down here, okay, and a cladogram is interesting because it only branches in 2 directions at any time, and every time you branch, you get something called a new derived character. So let's look at this cladogram down here. You've got the derived characters listed here on the backbone, and the reason why it's important you understand this is you're going to make one of these with your cytochrome C lab. Every time you get a new characteristic, you branch, okay? So this lamprey branched before the characteristic showed up, right? So this is like in time along this axis here, okay? So what that means is the lamprey does not have jaws, but everything from this point on has a jaw, okay? Sharks have jaws, but notice they branch before lungs. So that means sharks lack the lungs, but everything else along this line has lungs. Amniotic membranes, in other words, eggs that have membranes inside of them, they're waterproof. Well, the salamanders branch before that, but everything else has that, and so on. And you just keep going all the way down the cladogram. Cladograms are really nice because they're easy to read, they're simple to understand, and they really cut to the most important characteristics, and those important characteristics are listed on the cladogram. Phylogenetic trees are based on all of the data and all the evidence that we have, and you can see one here. I just put a little one here, and notice how complicated they get. You can get 3-way splits, like you see right here, where 3 things are branching at one time, or here's another place where there's more than 3 things branching at one time. They're a little harder to read. Most people go with cladograms nowadays, okay, just because they're a little bit easier and you're only focusing on a few characteristics at a time. But those are the 2 graphics that are used to represent phylogeny, or how things are related to one another. So once you've classified organisms, you can arrange them on these graphics. That's classification. Not much else that you need to know. Not a difficult concept, but you definitely want to make sure you know this before the test.